What's impossible? See, a lot of things that we assume are impossible have actually already been done. For example, if I had a nickel for every time a woman was drafted by an NBA team, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird it happened twice. Both of these players actually had interesting paths to get to their unique place in history. Well, not unique. What's a word for unique, but it's been done twice? And the context of how they got to be there taught me a lot about the history of women's sports. So let's dig into it right now. The first person we're going to talk about is a woman by the name of Denise Long. She was drafted by the San Francisco Warriors in the 13th round of the 1969 draft. 13th round? Now there's only 2. Past is weird. How did she overcome the sexism of her time to convince the Warriors to give her a chance to compete alongside the men? Long story short, she didn't. Long story long, Denise Long was already just about as popular as a high school basketball player could get. And for good reason. She averaged nearly 70 points per game during her high school career, including a 111-point explosion. That broke Wilt Chamberlain's high school record. The LA Times later called her the patron saint of girls basketball. Now, you might not think of Iowa as a basketball state, or ever think about Iowa at all, but girls basketball was a pretty big deal in the Midwest. Long's final high school game was a state championship that aired on TV stations in 6 states.
Reaching into 9 Midwest states.
In 6 states.
9 Midwest states.
Rocketing her to real, actual stardom. Like she was national news. She even got a Tonight Show appearance later on. So the owner of the Warriors thought, I'll spend a late-round draft pick on a little publicity stunt. The first woman in the NBA. Almost immediately after it happened, the commissioner voided the pick. I guess he thought the whole thing was tomfoolery. Turns out it kind of was tomfoolery. The owner never had any intention of having her on the team, but he did have something in mind. To quote, "I needed to generate interest in the women's basketball thing." He wanted to start a professional women's basketball league. I say professional in quotation marks because they were never paid, even though they actually had to play 5 quarters a game, 4 before the Warriors games and then 1 as an exhibition at halftime. Denise played a whole season with the team with the promise that it would help her qualify for the U.S. women's basketball team at the 1970 Olympics. But then there wasn't women's basketball at the 1970 Olympics, so she was left pretty disillusioned by the whole process. Now, I can hear you. I don't feel sorry for Denise. She should have not taken the deal. And, yeah, she shouldn't. You should never work for free. It's just not good policy. But remember, 1, she still loved basketball at that point, and there was nowhere else she could really play at a high level. And 2, she was 19. We all make bad decisions at 19. We all take bad deals at 19. I thought working for content mills at less than minimum wage would help me break into sports writing when I was 19. And we can see where that left me. One of the big what-ifs with Denise that a lot of people like to kick around an idea is whether she would have actually been able to play with the guys. On the one hand, she was mostly known as a shooter, so she could have found a role similar to like a late career Ray Allen, like a pure shooter type. So even though she may not have been able to keep up physically with the likes of Lou Alcindor, the number 1 pick of her draft class, who later changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and became the all-time leader in points scored, it's not absurd to theorize whether she could have found some kind of offensive role in the late 60s, early 70s. On the other hand, which hand did I use? On the other hand, she had never played defense in a competitive setting at the time of the draft. See, all this about Denise, her absurd stats and her stardom, the questions of whether she could have played with the boys, there is a pretty big caveat. And it's not just this thing, which, let's just not even start talking about that. No, it's that she played a different kind of basketball than what we all know. Girls weren't allowed to play regular basketball in high school in most states. They had to play a variety called 6-on-6, or basket, which is just a lovely word. It's a feminine form of basket. I'm a big fan of that word. Okay. So with 6-on-6, you've got 6 players on each team. 3 are only allowed to play offense, the forwards, and 3 are only allowed to play defense, the guards. You're only allowed to dribble twice, and you can't cross the half-court line ever. So it would have been pretty hard for Miss Long to make the change. To understand this, we need to understand the origins of women's sports. Back when basketball was invented in the 19th century, the world was a different place. The idea of women even playing sports in Victorian society was maybe not exactly foreign, but it was seen as unbecoming. Here's what Senda Berenson, a pioneer of women's basketball, said of the women of the time. Until recent years, the so-called ideal woman was a small-waisted, small-footed, small-brained damsel who prided herself on her delicate health and who thought fainting interesting and hysterics fascinating. She was awesome. We're going to talk more about her in a minute. Victorian ideals emphasized and exaggerated the relative differences between men and women and the relative weakness of the ladies, to the point where the idea of a woman exerting herself at all was considered unhealthy for her fragile constitution. Of course, we all now realize this to be nonsense. Well, most of us realize this now to be nonsense. It turns out that both males and females need to exercise in order to be healthy. Who would have thought? Well, some did think, including Miss Berenson. She felt that physical education should be mandatory for boys and girls, and she pushed hard for it. With women entering the workplace in the late 1800s, she felt it was important for girls to get into good condition so that they had a chance to compete for good salaries in their new careers. She basically went up to a school and said, "I want to be your girls' PE teacher." And they were like, "We don't have a girls' PE teacher." And she said, "You do now," and started running laps. The newly invented basketball showed promise for her means. Her first exhibition was a little rocky. She accidentally dislocated a player's arm on the first jump ball, but everyone thought it was otherwise a fun way to exercise. But Berenson decided to modify the rules to reduce what she called the tendency for roughness. Remember, she didn't want to create great athletes or competitive marvels. Her goal was to help women break free from Victorian restrictions, to get more in shape and get real jobs. Her goals were to improve health and mentality, ultimately helping women to become their own people. A player getting injured or, roughhousing each other, that just didn't serve the purpose. So she invented 6-on-6. She also discouraged intramural, this is hard to say, intramural competition, considering it an unnecessary distraction. So 6-on-6 wasn't actually created out of sexism, just a difference in purpose, plus a little bit of a mother knows best kind of thing. But eventually the sport started getting phased out in high schools in the US, starting even before Denise Long got big. Everybody just decided it wasn't cool to have vastly different rules for boys and girls anymore, although netball still exists. By the early 70s, nearly every state had banned 6-on-6 and allowed girls to play full-on high school basketball, with defense and more than 2 dribbles and all sorts of crazy stuff. This naturally led to the development of women's college basketball, which elevated the quality of play even further. At first, none of these women could get scholarships for playing the sport. They just didn't have the support, and Title 11? 9? Goodness, I've forgotten which one it is now. But, the thing that says that you can't treat men and women's sports differently, that didn't exist yet, so the schools weren't required to give them scholarships and to support them. So they had to string together academic scholarships and other student aid to make it through school. But some of them were still really good. One of them in particular was considered so good that she got drafted by the New Orleans Jazz. And this time it wasn't just a publicity stunt. There was a genuine belief in league circles that Lucia Harris was her name, had some kind of chance at cracking a real roster when she was selected. She'd averaged nearly 26 points per game on 63% shooting and 15 rebounds per game at Delta State. Pretty promising numbers, even if it was against the fairly untested competition of early women's collegiate basketball. She also helped the U.S. get gold at the Pan America Games and led the team in scoring on the way to Olympic silver. Then she was invited to participate in the Jazz's training camp, and she said no. She later explained that she'd gotten pregnant. As disappointing as it was that she never even got the chance to practice with a pro team, it's hard to imagine she would have had a positive experience being the only woman in the NBA at the time. She would have faced a lot of pressure to perform, nearly perfectly, otherwise risk being really impolitely heckled by the more impolite of fans. You can just think about how every mistake she would have made would have been greeted with tremendous disrespect, as it is of everyone who tries something new. And she probably knew that. A couple of years later, she did play a little bit of pro ball against her own sex. So it's not like she just completely gave up on the idea of playing basketball. But yeah, the prospect of being ill-treated constantly probably didn't appeal to her. She ended up becoming a high school teacher and having 4 kids with her husband, so, good for her. She's in the Basketball Hall of Fame, too, mostly for her achievements in the young days of women's basketball. Their website declares her one of the most dominant centers of all time. So, like we asked with Denise Long, we asked with Lucia Harris, could she have made it in the NBA? Only if she accepted a vastly different role. See, she was a tremendously skilled and powerful center, but she was only 6'3", which even in 1979 was tiny for an interior player. But Charles Barkley existed. He was only an inch taller, and he was known as one of the best power forwards of all time. So, maybe. We'll never know for sure, but it wouldn't have been an easy path, and probably would have entailed a lot of adjustment to her game that would have been hard to make. With both of these exceptional women, it's easy to focus on what could have been. What would have happened if they had been given the chance to play, how they would have changed the game, would they have opened up the path for more women to play alongside the men? We'll never know, but it all seems unlikely. But what we do know is that they really did make an impact of their own, not just with hypotheticals, but with what they really did. And that alone is worth talking about. They both blazed the trail for women's basketball. They became stars in their own right long before that kind of thing was common. So that's worth pointing out, along with the fun of thinking about the hypotheticals.